but I wanted to read one particular text that isn't in the text of King's speech, but is later in the same chapter of one of the verses he quotes. And I wondered, as he read his scripture, which he clearly knew well, if perhaps this scripture did not give him encouragement in his work. Do you not know, have you not heard, the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. The word of the Lord. "100 years before Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln's historic proclamation made all slaves free in the eyes of the federal government. King, standing in front of Lincoln's memorial 100 years later, acknowledged that this momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of slaves who had been seared in the flames of injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to the end of the long night of their captivity. But as King assessed the plight of blacks 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he saw a people that continued to be, quote, crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. He called to light the great poverty of his people, their second-class citizenship, and their continued systemic and personal injustices that they experience every day. On that warm August day in 1963, King was surrounded by, estimates are, 250,000 people. They were cheering for him. They adored him. But on that day, those were not King's intended audience. The folks gathered there on the mall and around the Lincoln Memorial and spanning clear to the Washington Monument and beyond, they already believed in the cause. They were already bought in. King, on that day, was speaking to the rest of America. All three networks. It seems weird because that was a time when there was no cable. There were just three networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. That was it. But all three carried King's speech live that day. And it was through this television medium that King was able to speak to the farmer in Nebraska, or the school teacher in California, or the auto worker in Ohio. His hope on that day was to touch the hearts of the ambivalent and the undecided, and to bring them shoulder to shoulder in this crusade for justice, for love, and for hope. Now in 1963, this was no small task, to stir the hearts of a largely white nation. The speech began rather predictably with references to the Emancipation Proclamation, the U.S. Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence. Through the early part of the speech, King made legal arguments. He reminded the listener that these governing documents granted all people, black and white, quote, the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm a political junkie, and around election time, if you've ever watched, they have these focus groups, whether it's Fox News or whether it's CNN, and they show, after the big speeches, they show these groups and they hit these buzzers, things that resonated with them, positive, and things I didn't like that so much. I wonder how that audience, as they began to hear King's words on that day across the airwaves, would have pressed those buttons. I suspect that at the beginning of the speech, when King went into legal arguments, they were probably pressing the not-so-impressed button. And King, perhaps in his great wisdom, knew that. He knew that he had to go beyond a constitutional law argument if he was to win the hearts and the minds of Middle America. So at that critical point, King took his speech to the next level. He began to evoke moral law. He began to invoke God's name. King proclaimed, now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all God's children. Yet when you invoke the name of God, you go down a perilous slope. Many before and many after Martin Luther King Jr. have called on the name of God to support their cause. Wars, some just and some not so just, have been fought in God's name. And in 1963, some of the strongest supporters of the status quo were the white churchgoers. Stephen R. Haynes writes that segregation's staunchest proponents continued to fight, insisting that integration was the leading edge of a social revolution bent on overthrowing God's established order. In our faith tradition, as we think about Scripture and the power that lies in Scripture, we believe that Scripture interpretation is best done within the community. As several people read and engage in Scripture, it is likely that any of us will bring too many of our own biases. We will be able to balance each other out. But even this practice has its limitations, because we must have some level of diversity, or we simply bring the same biases to the Word. In his I Have a Dream speech, King interpreted Scripture on the public stage. He began to make the case that the words he spoke and the message he brought that day were not his own, but God's. The hope, the vision, and the dream that King spoke of were not from him, but from God. He was simply a messenger of what God had wanted all along. And as evidence, he went to the good word. He began to quote Scripture after Scripture, time and time again throughout the rest of the speech. When King said, "We are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream," those weren't his words. He was quoting from Amos 5:24. Amos, the great prophet, prophesied in a time when Judah was at the zenith of its political power, but inwardly it was corrupt, and the masses were supporting the wealth and prosperity of a few. King said in the speech, "I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together." These poetic and inspirational words come from Isaiah 4 and 5, a little earlier in the same chapter I read just a few minutes ago. Isaiah in his time attacked the social ills of his day, not because he was purely a social reformer, but because he believed that these social ills were symptomatic of a larger spiritual decline among God's people. When King, in that famous speech, pointed forward to quote that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing, King was not merely hoping for a Coca-Cola moment. "I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony." That's not what he was about. He was quoting from Galatians 3:28. It was reminding the listener that rooted in Scripture was the idea that God's big tent was not exclusionary, but was inclusionary. God's love was for all people. We are all God's people. We are all God's children. We are all brothers and sisters, regardless of the many surface things that separate us.